Historical Summary of Aesthetic as Science of Expression and General Linguistic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sharon Greer. Aesthetic as Science of Expression and General Linguistic by Benedetto Croce. Translated by Douglas Ainslie, 1865 to 1948. Section 3. 17th and 18th centuries. The 17th century is remarkable for the ferment of thought upon this difficult problem. Such words as genius, taste, imagination or fancy and feeling appear in this literature and deserve a passing notice. As regards the word genius, we find the Italian ingegno opposed to the intellect, and dialectic adorned with the attributes of the latter, while rhetoric has the advantage of ingegno in all its forms, such as concetti and acutezzi. With these, the English word ingenious has an obvious connection, especially in its earlier use as applied to men of letters. The French worked upon the word ingegno and evolved from it in various associations the expressions esprit, beaux esprits. The manual of the Spanish Jesuit Balthazar Gracian became celebrated throughout Europe, and here we find ingegno described as the truly inventive faculty, and from it the English word genius, the Italian genio, the French génie first enter into general use. The word gusto or taste, good taste in its modern sense, also sprang into use about this time. Taste was held to be a judicial faculty directed to the beautiful, and thus to some extent distinct from the intellectual judgment. It was further bisected into active and passive, but the former ran into the definition of ingegno, the latter describes sterility. The word gusto or taste as judgment was in use in Italy at a very early period, and in Spain we find Lope de Vega and his contemporaries declaring that their object is to delight the taste of their public. These uses of the word are not of significance as regards the problem of art, and we must return to Balthazar Gracian 1642 for a definition of taste as a special faculty or attitude of the soul. Italian writers of the period echo the praises of this laconic moralist, who, when he spoke of a man of taste, meant to describe what we call today a man of tact in the conduct of life. The first use of the word in a strictly aesthetic sense occurs in France in the last quarter of the 17th century. La Bruyère writes in his Caractère 1688, Il y a dans l'art un point de perfection, comme de bonté ou de maturité dans la nature. Celui qui le sent et qui l'aime a le goût parfait, celui qui ne le sent pas et qui n'aime au-delà a le goût défectueux. Il y a donc un bon et un mauvais goût, et l'on dispute des goûts avec fondement. Delicacy and variability or variety were appended as attributes of taste. This French definition of the Italian word was speedily adopted in England, where it became good taste, and we find it used in this sense in Italian and German writers of about this period. The words imagination and fancy were also passed through the crucible in this century. We find the Cardinal Sforza of Pallavicino, 1644, blaming those who took for truth or falsehood for the very similar or for historical truth in poetry. Poetry, he holds, has to do with the primary apprehensions, which give neither truth nor falsehood. Thus the fancy takes the place of the very similar of certain students of Aristotle. The Cardinal continues his eloquence with the clinching remark that if the intention of poetry were to be believed true, then its real end would be falsehood, which is absolutely condemned by the law of nature and by God. The sole object of poetic fables is, he says, to adorn our intellect with sumptuous, new, marvellous and splendid imaginings. And so great has been the benefits accruing from this to the human race, that poets have been rewarded with a glory superior to any other, and their names have been crowned with divine honours. This, he says in his treatise Del Bene, has been the just reward of poets, albeit they have not been bearers of knowledge, nor have they manifested truth. This throwing of the bridle on the neck of Pegasus seemed to Muratori 60 years later to be altogether too risky a proceeding, although advocated by a prince of the church. He reinserts the bit of the verisimilar, though he talks with admiration of the fancy, that inferior apprehensive faculty which is content to represent things, without seeking to know if they be true or false, a task which it leaves to the superior apprehensive faculty of the intellect. The severe Gravina, too, finds his heart touched by the beauty of poetry when he calls it a witch but wholesome. As early as 1578, Huarte had maintained that eloquence is the work of the imagination, not of the intellect. In England, Bacon, 1605, attributed knowledge to the intellect, history to memory, and poetry to the imagination or fancy. Hobbes described the manifestations of the latter, and Addison devoted several numbers of The Spectator to the analysis of the pleasures of the imagination. During the same period, the division between those who are accustomed à juger par les sentiments and those who raisonnent par les principes became marked in France. Dubos, 1719, is an interesting example of the upholder of the feelings as regards the production of art. Indeed, there is, in his view, no other criterion, and the feeling for art is a sixth sense, against which intellectual argument is useless. This French school of thought found a reflex in England, with the position assigned there to emotion in artistic work. But the confusion of such words as imagination, taste, feeling, wit, shows that at this time there was a suspicion that these words were all applicable to the same fact. Alexander Pope thus distinguished wit and judgment. For wit and judgment often are at strife, though meant each other's aid like man and wife. But there was a divergence of opinion as to whether the latter should be looked upon as part of the intellect or not. There was the same divergence of opinion as to taste and intellectual judgment. As regards the former, the opposition to the intellectual principle was reinforced in the 18th century by Kant in his Critique der Urteilskraft. But Voltaire and writers anterior to him frequently fell back into intellectualist definitions of a word invented precisely to avoid them. Dacier, 1684, writes of taste as une harmonie, un accord de l'esprit et de la raison. The difficulties surrounding a true definition led to the creation of the expression non so che, or je ne sais quoi, or no sé qué, which throws into clear relief the confusion between taste and intellectual judgment. As regards imagination and feeling, or sentiment, there was a strong tendency to sensualism. The Cardinal Sforza Pallavicino talks of poetry as ignoring alike truth or falsehood, and yet delighting the senses. He approves of the remark that poetry should make us raise our eyebrows, but in later life this keen-eyed prince seems to have fallen back from the brilliant intuition of his earlier years into the pedagogic theory. Muratori was convinced that fancy was entirely sensual, and therefore he posted the intellect beside it, to refrain its wild courses, like a friend having authority. Gravina practically coincides in this view of poetic fancy, as a subordinate faculty incapable of knowledge, fit only to be used by moral philosophy for the introduction into the mind of the true by means of novelty and the marvellous. In England, also, Bacon held poetry to belong to the fancy, and assigned to it a place between history and science. Epic poetry he awarded to the former, parabolic poetry to the latter. Elsewhere he talks of poetry as a dream, and affirms that it is to be held rather as an amusement of the intelligence than as a science. For him, music, painting, sculpture, and the other arts are merely pleasure-giving. Addison reduced the pleasures of the imagination to those caused by visible objects, or by ideas taken from them. These pleasures he held to be inferior to those of the senses and less refined than those of the intellect. He looked upon imaginative pleasure as consisting in resemblances discovered between imitations and things imitated, between copies and originals, an exercise adapted to sharpen the spirit of observation. The sensualism of the writers headed by Dubos, who looked upon art as a mere pastime, like a tournament or a bullfight, shows that the truth about aesthetic had not yet succeeded in emerging from the other spiritual activities. Yet the new words and the new views of the 17th century have great importance for the origins of aesthetic. They were the direct result of the restatement of the problem by the writers of the Renaissance, who themselves took it up where antiquity had left it. These new words and the discussions which arose from them were the demands of aesthetic for its theoretical justification. But they were not able to provide this justification, and it could not come from elsewhere. With Descartes, we are not likely to find much sympathy for such studies as relate to wit, taste, fancy, or feelings. He ignored the famous non soce. He abhorred the imagination, which he believed to result from the agitation of the animal spirits. He did not altogether condemn poetry, but certainly looked upon it as the folie du logis, which must be strictly supervised by the reason. Boileau is the aesthetic equivalent of Cartesian intellectualism. Boileau, que la raison a ses règles engage. Boileau, the enthusiast for allegory. France was infected with the mathematical spirit of Cartesianism, and all possibility of a serious consideration of poetry and of art was thus removed. Witness the diatribes of Malebranche against the imagination, and listen to the Italian Antonio Conti, writing from France in 1756 on the theme of the literary disputes that were raging at the time. They have introduced the method of M. Descartes into belles lettres. They judge poetry and eloquence independently of their sensible qualities. Thus they also confound the progress of philosophy with that of the arts. The Abbé Terrasson says that the moderns are greater geometricians than the ancients. Therefore, they are greater orators and greater poets. Lamotte, Fontenelle, Boileau, and Malebranche carried on this battle, which was taken up by the encyclopedists, and when Dubos published his daring book, Jean-Jacques Lebel published a reply to it, 1726, in which he denied to sentiment its claim to judge of art. Thus Cartesianism could not possess an aesthetic of the imagination. The Cartesian J.P. de Crousaz, 1715, found the beautiful to consist in what is approved of, and thereby reduced it to ideas, ignoring the pleasing and sentiment. Locke was an intellectualist in the England of this period, as was Descartes in France. He speaks of wit as combining ideas in an agreeable variety, which strikes the imagination, while the intellect or judgment seeks for differences according to truth. The wit, then, consists of something which is not at all in accordance with truth and reason. For Shaftesbury, taste is a sense or instinct for the beautiful, of order and proportion, identical with the moral sense and with its preconceptions, anticipating the recognition of reason. Body, spirit, and God are the 3 degrees of beauty. Francis Hutcheson proceeded from Shaftesbury and made popular the internal sense of beauty, which lies somewhere between sensuality and rationality, and is occupied with discussing unity in variety, concord in multiplicity, and the true, the good, and the beautiful in a substantial identity. Hutcheson allied the pleasure of art with this sense, that is, with the pleasure of imitation and of the likeness of the copy to the original. This he looked upon as relative beauty, to be distinguished from absolute beauty. The same view dominates the English writers of the 18th century, among whom may be mentioned Reid, the head of the Scottish school, and Adam Smith. With far greater philosophical vigour, Leibniz in Germany opened the door to that crowd of psychic facts which Cartesian intellectualism had rejected with horror. His conception of reality as continuous, natura non facit saltus, left room for imagination, taste, and their congeners. Leibniz believed that the scale of being ascended from the lowliest to God. What we now term aesthetic facts were then identified with what Descartes and Leibniz had called confused knowledge, which might become clear but not distinct. It might seem that when he applied this terminology to aesthetic facts, Leibniz had recognized their peculiar essence as being neither sensual nor intellectual. They are not sensual for him because they have their own clarity, differing from pleasure and sensual emotion, and from intellectual distinctio. But the Leibnizian law of continuity and intellectualism did not permit of such an interpretation. Obscurity and clarity are here to be understood as quantitative grades of a single form of knowledge, the distinct or intellectual toward which they both tend and reach at a superior grade. Though artists judge with confused perceptions, which are clear but not distinct, these may yet be corrected and proved true by intellective knowledge. The intellect clearly and distinctly knows the thing which the imagination knows confusedly, but clearly. This view of Leibniz amounts to saying that the realization of a work of art can be perfected by intellectually determining its concept. Thus Leibniz held that there was only one true form of knowledge, and that all other forms could only reach perfection in that. His clarity is not a specific difference, it is merely a partial anticipation of his intellective distinction. To have posited this grade is an important achievement, but the view of Leibniz is not fundamentally different from that of the creators of the words and intuitions already studied. All contributed to attract attention to the peculiarity of aesthetic facts. Speculation on language at this period revealed an equally determined intellectualist attitude. Grammar was held to be an exact science, and grammatical variations to be explainable by the ellipse, by abbreviation, and by failure to grasp the typical logical form. In France, with Arnold 1660, we have the rigorous Cartesian intellectualism. Leibniz and Locke both speculated upon this subject, and the former all his life nourished the thought of a universal language. The absurdity of this is proved in this volume. A complete change of the Cartesian system upon which Leibniz based his own was necessary if speculation were ever to surpass the Leibnizian aesthetic. But Wolff and the other German pupils of Leibniz were as unable to shake themselves free of the all-pervading intellectualism as were the French pupils of Descartes. Meanwhile, a young student of Berlin named Alexander Amadeus Baumgarten was studying the Wolffian philosophy and at the same time lecturing in poetry and Latin rhetoric. While so doing, he was led to rethink and pose afresh the problem of how to reduce the precepts of rhetoric to a rigorous philosophical system. Thus it came about that Baumgarten published in September 1735, at the age of 21, as the thesis of his degree of doctor, an opuscule entitled Meditationes Philosophicae de Nonnullis ad Poema Pertinentibus, and in it we find written for the first time the word aesthetic as the name of a special science. Baumgarten ever afterwards attached great importance to his juvenile discovery and lectured upon it by request in 1742 at Frankfurt on the Oder and again in 1749. It is interesting to know that in this way Immanuel Kant first became acquainted with the theory of aesthetic, which he greatly altered when he came to treat of it in his philosophy. In 1750, Baumgarten published the first volume of a more ample treatise, and a second part in 1762, but illness and death in 1762 prevented his completing his work. What is aesthetic for Baumgarten? It is the science of sensible knowledge. Its objects are the sensible facts, aestheta, which the Greeks were always careful to distinguish from the mental facts, noeta. It is therefore scientia cognitionis sensitive, theoria liberalium artium, nociologia inferia, ars pulchre cognitande, ars analogi rationis. Rhetoric and poetic are for him special cases of aesthetic, which is a general science embracing both. Its laws are diffused among all the arts, like the mariner's star, cynosura quaedam, and they must be always referred to in all cases, for they are universal, not empirical or merely inductive. Falsa regula pejor esquam nulla. Aesthetic must not be confounded with psychology, which supplies only suppositions. Aesthetic is an independent science, which gives the rules for knowing sensibly and is occupied with the perfection of sensible knowledge, which is beauty. Its contrary is ugliness. The beauty of objects and of matter must be excluded from the beauty of sensible knowledge, because beautiful objects can be badly thought and ugly objects beautifully thought. Poetic representations are those which are confused or imaginative. Distinction and intellectuality are not poetic. The greater the determination, the greater the poetry. Individuals absolutely determined, omnimodo determinata, are very poetical, as are images or fancies and everything which refers to feeling. The judgment of sensible and imaginative representations is taste. Such are, in brief, the truths which Baumgarten stated in his Meditationes and further developed and exemplified in his Aesthetica. Close study of the two works above mentioned leads to the conviction that Baumgarten did not succeed in freeing himself from the unity of the Leibnizian monadology. He obtained from Leibniz his conception of the poetic as consisting of the confused, but German critics are wrong in believing that he attributed to it a positive, not a negative quality. Had he really done this, he would have broken at a blow the unity of the Leibnizian monad and conquered the science of aesthetic. This giant step he did not take. He failed to banish the contradictions of Leibniz and of the other intellectualists. To posit a perfection did not suffice. It was necessary to maintain it against the lex continui of Leibniz and to proclaim its independence of all intellectualism. Aesthetic truths for Baumgarten were those which did not seem altogether false or altogether true. In fact, the very similar. If it were objected to Baumgarten that one should not occupy oneself with what, like poetry, he defines as confused and obscure, he would reply that confusion is a condition of finding the truth, that we do not pass at once from night to dawn. Thus he did not surpass the thought of Leibniz in this respect. Poor Baumgarten was always in suspense lest he should be held to occupy himself with things unworthy of a philosopher. How can you, a professor of philosophy, dare to praise lying and the mixture of truth and falsehood? He imagined that some such reproach might be addressed to him on account of his purely philosophical speculations, and true enough, he actually received a criticism of his theory, in which it was argued that if poetry consisted of sensual perfection, then it was a bad thing for mankind. Baumgarten contemptuously replied that he had not the time to argue with those capable of confounding his oratio perfecta sensitiva with an oratio perfectae omnino sensitiva. The fact about Baumgarten is that apart from baptizing the new science aesthetic, and apart from his first definitions, he does not stray far from the old ruts of scholastic thought. The excellent Baumgarten, with all his ardour and all his convictions, is a sympathetic and interesting figure in the history of aesthetic, not yet formed, but in the process of formation. End of historical summary, part 2.